Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are logging on, watching, listening in the world, and welcome to the latest in our Infrastructure Intelligence live series of webinar events organised in association with our strategic partner communication specialists in the built environment, BECG. You're very welcome, everyone, today to this event. My name's Andy Walker. I'm the editor of Infrastructure Intelligence. And we are discussing the very topical issue of climate change today, and specifically COP26. We build this event as our COP26 preview webinar, and we basically want to sort of look at some of the issues around COP26. What do we expect? What should the opinion formers and politicians, world leaders, in fact, be talking about when they assemble in Glasgow in November? And crucially, what do we want to see as an industry sector around that? Thank you for everybody logging on and joining in today, and also for those watching again on YouTube, because we know there's quite a few of those, and good that you've broken away from queuing for petrol at the moment, which seems to be something that's occupying people's minds at the moment around the issue of climate change. Maybe we might get into some conversation around some of those issues later, but probably we won't be mentioning Kermit the Frog for those who have been keeping up to date with our Prime Minister's musings at international meetings in New York and elsewhere. So today we're going to be looking at what the UN have described as the defining issue of our time. And we are indeed, according to the UN and many others, including our own Prime Minister, at a defining moment. And I think it's fair to say that, like never before, the eyes of the world really will be on the UK, but not just the UK, because we know that this fight against climate change, the challenge of climate change, is a massive one and is one that needs to be solved on an international basis. And we also know that the construction and infrastructure sector has got a crucial role to play in that situation. And frankly, without its active engagement in that battle, then there's no way that the battle against climate change can actually be won. And I think it is fair to say the ingenuity and expertise of construction professionals will be crucial in that process. As ever, we have an excellent panel of knowledgeable professionals with us today, who I will introduce briefly now and then in a bit more detail just before they speak. We have Zoe Hasman, who is the Vice President for Global Sustainability at Jacobs. We've got Peter McGettrick, Managing Director Advisory at Turner & Townsend. Mark Crouch, who's the Global Carbon Discipline Lead for Mott MacDonald. We did have Hélène Chartier, who is the Head of Zero Carbon Development for C4 Cities, and she's recorded a video for us. But unfortunately, for whatever reason, we've got an issue with the feed on the video from Hélène. So we will load that on our YouTube channel, so you'll be able to watch that, because it is an excellent little talk that she's done, and particularly talking about the concept of 15-minute cities, which I'm sure will come up in the conversation anyway, but I think it's well worth watching. So we'll share that on our social media as well. Then we have Matthew Farrow, who's the Director of Policy for the Environmental Industries Commission, and Jamie Gordon from BECG's, their Director of Infrastructure and Energy, will speak last, and then we'll have a conversation and a discussion. If you've got any questions for the panel, it doesn't matter which one or all, please put them in the chat and we'll get to them. If you want to say where you're from in terms of your firm, happy for you to do that as well. More than happy to give you a name check. Anyway, we need to move on to our first speaker, and that is Zoe Hasman, who is, as I said earlier, the Vice President for Global Sustainability at Jacobs, where she's responsible, as her job title implies, for the global sustainability strategy and integration of ESG, environmental, social and governance related business risks and opportunities, and under now a carbon neutral organisation and 100% renewable company, and is, I think it's fair to say, recognised as a leader in climate change. And that's enough from me. Zoe, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Andy. Hi to everybody. I've had that wonderful alert just pop up saying my internet is unstable. So hopefully you can hear me and I don't cut out, but just a pre-warning that, you always want that just before you speak in a webinar. So apologies in advance, but hopefully it will stick with me. So yeah, thanks again, Andy. Pleasure to be here today and join this discussion alongside all my peers here. And certainly with this audience, probably don't need to spell out where we're at. And Andy, you mentioned it earlier, but we are, as a world, as a globe, in the middle of a series of critical and complex events. On top of the pandemic, extreme weather events, wildfires, hurricanes and flash floods, we've also got, that all overlaid on, the ongoing issues around access to clean water, affordable and reliable energy, increased health issues, environmental pollution, socio-economic inequalities, and the fastest rate of biodiversity loss that we've ever seen on the planet. And I'm sorry I'm painting not a very cheery picture on a Friday sunny morning, but I think what this gets to and why we're all here and in these roles probably is the world needs more innovators and problem solvers who aren't afraid to reframe these challenges and think differently about them. And I think this is both an opportunity and also a moral responsibility for our industry. So as Andy said, I'm responsible for developing and implementing Jacobs' global sustainability strategy. And that is really to ensure that we deliver on our purpose as an organisation, which is providing solutions for a more connected and sustainable world. So we're doing this for our own business, but as well helping our clients to really navigate all of those complexities that I mentioned and reframe those challenges so we can maximise sustainable outcomes, drive efficiency, help transition the economy to a net zero one and create a positive impact for environment, society and economy. And with just 5 weeks, I think it is now, and the clock is ticking to and before COP26, it really is time for world leaders to get serious and step up both on the commitments, the NDCs, the national determined contributions for each country, and make sure that we are rising to meet the scale of what we face in order to fight the climate crisis. And if you read the UN synthesis report that has just been published, we're still not quite there. There's still a lot of work to go. So hopefully that has helped us set the stage for COP26. Currently, global efforts are still going in the wrong direction, with countries still projected to emit more carbon in 2030 than in 2010. Which could lead to a global warming approaching 2.7 degrees by the end of the century. So the question is, what can our industry do to remain on that 1.5 degree trajectory? And there's a bunch of things that we can do that we're already doing, but arguably we need to do more and faster. Some of those are we really must put into practice a commitment and a set of behaviours that drive us even further to establishing and implementing systems, standards, practices that are going to underpin this zero carbon economy. We need a new economic foundation, one that's founded on enabling both people and planet to survive, adapt and thrive. And when you think about the speed of change required, COP26 is going to be an absolutely vital vehicle and platform to support that. We need outcomes from COP26 that set out a clear vision for how our leaders will create the right conditions for international collaboration that drive effective mechanisms and standards for change. And this includes the levers that are not only directed to enable and deliver decarbonisation, but also to ensure that wider societal and resiliency needs are met. So investment and policy decisions and solutions need to address and seek to balance across all of societal, economic and environmental needs. I think COP26 needs to accelerate the mechanisms to drive a far more integrated programmatic systems of systems approach across decarbonisation, the global energy transition, climate change adaptation and resilience, and also natural resource stewardship. It's a lot, I know. And all of these mitigation measures are interrelated and interdependent, and they must be viewed holistically to develop solutions that enable both our planet and people to survive. And it's going to require multi-stakeholder collaboration to agree that system-wide solution. It's a real challenge. Rather than taking the easier siloed approach. And if we look at the energy transition, for example, historically individual countries, they used to take ownership of investing in diverse mix of low carbon energies. But now the scale is really so vast that we need multiple stakeholders across geographic boundaries to really come together to implement collective systems and policies. I think one of the things that we view as well is delivery of the mega infrastructure programs that Jacobs is involved in a lot around the world can really serve as a valuable model to help us look at how we decarbonise our cities and communities, where cross-boundary, multi-stakeholder solutions are needed to ideate and deliver projects that address these complex mitigation measures, not just for climate change, but also that wider societal and environmental issues as well. And a more integrated approach will find synergistic opportunities between the different projects, assets, and stakeholders. So taking this programmatic approach to look beyond just the traditional project and asset boundaries and really bring together multiple stakeholders to co-develop solutions, I think that is how we can address the most urgent needs of the community. And just to shift the focus just a little bit, talking about nature-based solutions, they've often held an important role in our global efforts to manage our carbon footprint. But the world coastal ecosystems, and they're particularly adept at removing and storing carbon dioxide. But in many areas of the world now, salt marshes, mangroves, seagrasses and algae have been severely degraded. Nature-based solutions can provide a really cost-effective approach to mitigating and adapting to climate change. But we do need to make sure appropriate quality assurance standards are needed and they're expanded to really cover and support these solutions in the future as well. The standards that we need around carbon sequestration really must be inclusive of blue carbon environments, particularly as they can help alleviate the pressure for some of the land to fulfill these environmental functions. So I'd like to see the potential for habitat restoration and creation opportunity be made more explicit at COP26, including more detail on the mechanisms for carbon offsetting through nature-based solutions. So there's a lot resting on the success of COP26, and there's a lot resting on everyone really to pull together while we still have this dwindling chance. And I see our industry making great strides, certainly within all of our own organisations, really sort of pushing forward in that area, but also driving advancements with a lot of our clients as well. But the need for us, as well as every industry, is we need to go faster, and we need to go further, and we need to go faster. So I'm really excited and a little bit anxious to see what transpires over the next couple of months, because it's really going to determine the future for all of us. Thanks, Andy.
Thank you very much for that, Zoe. I think there's a couple of interesting points that I'm sure we'll come back to in the discussion. This concept of nature-based solutions, I think, is an interesting one, and how that relates to resetting the balance, really, offsetting and so on. But also, we want a clear vision from the politicians. I think there's something that we can do as an industry in relation to try and influencing that vision as well. And I think that's maybe something we can have a conversation about. The one thing that really struck me, though, when you were speaking, and it's obvious when you think about it, and that's this concept of multi-stakeholder collaboration. I mean, you've just got to work together on this issue. Everybody does. And I think, well, you could say that about anything, but that is a massive challenge, isn't it? On a number of different levels with vested interests and all the rest of it. So, yes. So all interesting points, which I know we'll come back to. Our next speaker is Peter McGettrick, who is the Managing Director Advisory at Turner and Townsend. He's responsible there for around 400 professionals who work across a number of different services, consulting, technology, health and safety and quality, and he works closely with a range of clients to protect and optimize the potential of their projects and their business performance. And I'm sure that for him, like for all of our panel, this particular issue is quite central to what he does. So, Peter, over to you.
Thank you, Andy, and thank you for the introduction. It's a pleasure to be here, and great to be involved in a discussion regarding, what I consider to be the most important issue affecting our sector. And we're all excitedly anticipating COP26 and some of the big changes that perhaps can happen that can accelerate the pace of change that we're all hoping to see. As Annie said, I look after advisory in Turner and Townsend, which also contains our net zero consultancy. I also board sponsor for our own internal net zero campaign and strategy to get to net zero by 2030 and already carbon neutral. As another role that I have, actually, I'm acting as chair of the British Safety Council, which is a large global charity which currently has a campaign called Time to Breathe, which tries to raise awareness about climate change and the impact of air quality and outdoor workers across the globe. So there's quite an interesting dimension there. I think overall this subject is so broad and has so many different dimensions, but I think we can all safely agree that infrastructure is absolutely critical to success in terms of climate action. The climate crisis is here. Every part of our industry now recognises that. I think the challenge is to somehow try and channel and convert that energy and goodwill that we're seeing into positive action that will make a difference. Infrastructure has such an incredibly complex role to play in climate action. On one hand, the built environment as a whole, and infrastructure in particular, has one of the most significant carbon footprints of any sector. And this makes decarbonising the way that we build and operate infrastructure absolutely critical. I think how global infrastructure evolves over the next 30, 40, 50 years may be a major determinant in the impact of climate change on civilization. More money will need to be spent both on and in support of infrastructure in new ways, and a failure to adapt by not taking climate change into account in the design, construction, and maintenance of infrastructure assets will only cause additional cost to owners and operators, as well as leave entire communities exposed and vulnerable. Adaptation can deliver a really strong return, both in reducing costs from a climate-related damage perspective to infrastructure, but also avoid knock-on effects to wider society. And physically, we really need to invest in our infrastructure networks to make them more resilient. So what's the solution? So, I think we need to advocate a programmatic approach, and Zoe referred to that and touched on it in her presentation earlier. Success won't be achieved with a silver bullet or a big bang investment. Instead, we need a clear programmatic approach which embeds combating the climate crisis into everything that we do. When you look at where that expertise and experience sits globally, it's really an infrastructure and it's familiar territory. Major programs come down to understanding the interplay between different forces such as labour, materials, cost, skills, and forecasting where those relationships are headed. We need to consider climate action as a major programme, and we can't underestimate the complexity of the challenge and the array of different areas that intersects. With climate change, what we are seeing is this expressed in roadmaps. We're waiting on a UK roadmap, a national programme, but in the meantime, we see organisational roadmaps and sector roadmaps starting to take shape. Infrastructure operators can't act in a silo, so they need to look at how other critical sectors have adapted, how they're performing, and how they are forecasting to plan ahead. As with any major programme, an appreciation of risk is essential. Any roadmap needs to look at what could and what's likely to change. Otherwise, you end up with a fantastic plan, but on paper, it won't achieve its goals, and that would be disastrous. The interplay between climate action on one hand and climate crisis on the other is especially important. The effects of climate change will make it harder for infrastructure to achieve net zero, and I think that will happen in 3 different ways. Firstly, the need for engineering to combat climate crisis could increase the carbon footprint of the sector. So we're going to need more complex engineering, retrofit, and the shoring up of existing assets in order to deal with climate change. Secondly, we're going to see disruption of supply chains. The last year has been a case study in how slight changes in supply chains can cause major disruption, whether that's shipping, whether that's energy supply, or labour availability. And that's playing out right now, as Andy, you referred to earlier, in terms of the petrol crisis that's emerging. And finally, there's the question of cost. We're going to see a constrained investment landscape, and the cost of achieving net zero and the trade-offs involved aren't really being properly discussed at the moment. The job of a major programme team is to look at finding ways to forecast, reduce, mitigate, and justify costs. And those costs are going to be essential, because with climate action, it's not a case of can we afford it, it's a case of how do we afford it. Thanks, Andy.
Thanks very much, Peter. And it was good that you mentioned the issue of cost as well, which, I think, is inevitably one that does get discussed, and I'm sure we'll return to that. in the conversation as well. But this concept of embedding it into everything that gets done, I hope that is a change to where the industry and indeed procurement has been in the past. And if you listen to even what the Prime Minister said just the other day, where basically it was, using, sort of, as he always does, colourful language to talk about, sort of waking up and smelling the coffee and, we can't go on like this and all the rest of it. You hope that that's actually followed through in terms of the way in which the whole of society works. But, obviously, time will tell on that. Peter, for now, thanks. We'll return to you in the discussion. Our next panelist is Mark Crouch, who is the Global Carbon Discipline Lead for McDonald. He is an experienced carbon management consultant, and he's worked in the energy, environment and water sectors since 2003, which even with my poor mathematics is quite a long time. His area of expertise includes renewable and low carbon technologies, sustainability, energy and carbon markets, climate change resilience, resource efficiency and project management. So he should be pretty well qualified to talk about this issue of not just climate change, but again, what we're hoping to see from COP26. So, Mark, it's your turn.
Well, thank you for that introduction, Andy, and thank you again for inviting me along to talk today alongside such a fantastic panel. So, I hope I'll fulfill the brief according to that setup without repeating too much of what we've heard from Zoe and Peter, which I completely agree with. McDonald as an organisation, if like Turner and Townsend and Jacobs are also carbon neutral, and that's something that we're really supportive of and is really important. I'm also involved in developing our own approach to taking it much further than that to net zero, because I think for organisations of our profile, while it's really important to kind of hit that carbon neutral approach, we also have to realise that by far the biggest impact of what we can do is via our projects, is via industry collaboration, is via advocacy. That our own corporate emissions are tiny compared to the range of projects that we're involved with, and that's kind of the far more important angle. We've been involved in decarbonising infrastructure for a long time and kind of setting the policy agenda. So things like the infrastructure carbon review. So interesting to hear you pick up that point on cost around actually cutting carbon can often deliver kind of cost efficiencies as well. It doesn't always, but it's really important to, I suppose, get out of that mindset that actually decarbonising infrastructure does always come with a cost penalty, because actually working on the detail of this and delivering infrastructure in the right way, as well as the right infrastructure, can actually deliver a lot of carbon benefits as well as potentially cost benefits as well. So I think to emphasize, just to pick up on a couple of points that have been made by others, adaptation, resilience, broader sustainability are really important and are crucial considerations to come out of COP, nature-based solutions, etc. I am going to focus a little bit more on my area of kind of expertise and my current focus, which is around decarbonising infrastructure. And it is very clear that the relationship between infrastructure and climate change is really clear. I think estimates that around 70% of global greenhouse gas emissions stem from infrastructure. And that resilience point around the infrastructure does need to be resilient to the climate change that is already locked in, regardless of the pace of decarbonisation that needs to come. What's going on at COP at the kind of leadership level is really important for setting the conditions, and I think, like others, that we probably go into this with a bit of a sense of trepidation around kind of some reasons to be pessimistic, but some reasons to be optimistic. I'll start with the pessimistic ones around, have we done enough kind of work in kind of the, navigating the geopolitics and the pre-work in advance? And I know that the COVID situation has clearly been a big distraction. So there's maybe a few reasons to kind of be a little bit apprehensive about whether the conference will achieve some of those goals. But then we have heard in the last week some really positive signs, certainly come from the US on the financing and the commitment towards that kind of 100 billion for climate finance. We've heard China come out and commit to no longer financing coal overseas. So there's some reasons to be positive around what might happen kind of at that, high up kind of policy negotiation level around, these goals of mitigation, adaptation, finance and collaboration. But I think the point that I would make is, regardless of whether those negotiations are as successful as we all want and we all hope and we all need them to be, actually just by COP26 being there and being a focal point for the industry and kind of people we've got speaking here today, but many others, actually it's already begun to make a big difference. Leading organizations don't wait for the policy to be done to them. We anticipate it, we play a role in shaping it, and a lot of that is already happening, regardless of your role in delivering infrastructure. So I think some of the things that I would like to see developed at a kind of subnational level, around kind of clearer definition of net zero, what that means for an infrastructure project. We've all seen a lot of organizations commit to it. I think probably most of us can reflect upon the term being used in a way where maybe the people that are using it don't really understand it, and actually does that really apply in a project sense. And I think bringing that national level commitment and societal level commitment down to what actually applies at an asset owner operation, what applies in the context of a project, to really help people understand what their role in delivering this overall societal goal is. Because, as people have alluded to, infrastructure delivery is a complex system of systems. There's lots of members of the value chain that need to all collaborate together, even on just an individual project, never mind when we look at kind of sectoral wider changes. So I think having some clearer definitions of net zero that won't come out of really what's going on up in Glasgow, but will come out of what's going on across the industry and the kind of the focal point that's provided there. Having a more standardized approach to actually understanding carbon management. We've been involved in developing some of the standards that support this, such as PAS 2080, carbon management in infrastructure standard that's also going through a refresh at the moment. Having digital tools that mean, again, carbon management is no longer the preserve of kind of a small niche group of people that really understand it, but actually it becomes something that's really integral to the way that everyone that works on infrastructure projects, they really understand, whether your role is, as a QS or a designer or a contractor. It just becomes kind of streamlined and mainstreamed into things that we all do. We have a common framework for understanding carbon impacts of our projects. And of course, that's going to include a much greater focus on the embodied impacts of infrastructure as well. I think those of us that work on infrastructure projects have been talking about it for quite a long time, but perhaps in the general public, at the politician type level, actually understanding the impact of building new infrastructure and how significant a chunk that can be of the lifetime emissions is only really just kind of beginning to really be appreciated. And I know that some of the things that are being discussed at COP26 around things like carbon border tax adjustments that might place a greater emphasis on the carbon flows between countries in terms of materials that move around. I think that will again point to a much greater need to really understand embodied capital carbon impacts of infrastructure as well. I think the point that I'd like to end with is really around, this is one of the main goals of COP itself, collaboration, working together to deliver. And it's certainly something that filters down to the organizational level, collaboration, sharing of best practice. It's part of what things like today are about, really, is getting together and chew the fat and bounce around ideas. but there's also, you know, a lot of kind of industry work that's going on in forums. I'll give a quick plug to something that we're involved with, which is the kind of Carbon Crunch event that we run to bring together best practice stories, which is going ahead in a couple of weeks. But we're also involved in quite a few fringe events actually outside the main kind of COP event as well, including the Resilience Hub and Sustainable Innovation Forum. And those are the kind of places that, you know, we'll all get together collaboratively and begin to solve some of these issues.
Thanks very much, Mark, for that. I was interested, you mentioned COVID, because on the one hand, obviously that has, you know, sort of hampered a lot of life really, and a lot of activity. But I actually think the response to COVID shows that what's possible, you know, if we put our mind to it. Now, you could argue we had no choice because obviously people were dying, but then again, people are dying through climate change as well, and through emissions. And, you know, so I think that's an interesting one. And I think it would be, interesting to explore. You know, it speaks to political will, I think, as well. And I think we as an industry need to actually use some of the bigger picture issues that are going on in order to, you know, zone in on things like this and say, well, you did it with that, you should do it with that as well. You know, provided we've got the stuff to back it up, which I think we have. So I think that's really interesting as well. So yeah, just some thoughts on that. I'm sure we'll return to them when we come to the discussion. There's some good questions coming in the chat as well, including a nice one I see for Zoe. I'll give her a chance to have a quick look at that because I'll be posing that question to her a little bit later on. But that, you know, it's good to have a bit of debate. Out of discussion comes clarity, as somebody once said. But anyway, we'll get to that in a minute. Our next speaker is Matthew Farrow, who is the Director of Policy at the Environmental Industries Commission. And for those that don't know about the Environmental Industries Commission, it's a business association, funnily enough, for industries and firms that work in the environmental sector, and an excellent organisation at that, brilliant networking around the sector as well. So if you're not already involved with or attuned to the EIC, then make sure that you look them up after this event. Matthew is also the Director of Policy at the Association for Consultancy and Engineering as well. And in that dual role, he works to join up sustainability and infrastructure agendas on all of the key issues around this particular issue. In my opinion, my humble opinion, he's one of our sector's most knowledgeable spokespersons on green business issues, and he's always worth listening to. So after giving him that magnificent build-up, and just, I'll send the check or the invoice later, but Matthew, please give us the benefit of your wisdom.
Thanks, Andy. I think the check better be in the post, but I'll try to live up to that. I wanted to make 3 points just to sort of help get the discussion going. And the first is a sort of historical perspective. So what Andy didn't say is that I've been around in this sort of world a long time, too long probably, in the sort of environment business interface. And one thing that strikes me about the sort of current mood and situation as we build up to COP26 is it feels pretty similar to me to the situation we were in sort of 2006, 7, 8, the sort of mid-late 2000s, in a sense that climate change at that point was a massive UK government priority. So in 2006, the UK government held, I think it was the EU presidency and the G7 presidency simultaneously. And Tony Blair, no doubt with 90's legacy, decided to prioritise climate change as an absolute focus for those international sort of roles that we had. Cross-party support for all this. This was the time the Climate Change Act went through Parliament with almost no opposition at all, setting what at the time was seen as extremely demanding legal targets. Pretty much every business leader you spoke to at that time wanted to be on the right side of the argument. So I remember, for example, Terry Leahy, who used to run Tesco in those days, announcing that Tesco's would carbon footprint every one of their 30,000 product lines because they felt consumers should know about the carbon content of supply chains. And behind all this, or alongside all this, people were really building expectations for COP15, which was the 2009 equivalent of what we're building up to now, which was held in Copenhagen, I think, at the time. And yet, alas, it all went wrong, partly no doubt because of the financial crash that sort of happened in the middle of all that. But what you found was that, you know, governments and businesses became very distracted by the sort of core economic situation. I remember some of the UK policies, which at the time were pretty world leading, and things like the CRC energy efficiency scheme were actually rolled back by the government at the time, the zero carbon homes commitment a little bit later and so forth. And COP15 was a big disappointment. I think Obama at the end desperately managed to get some sort of statement cobbled together, which countries normally signed up to, but it did not lead to the sort of move forward that people generally expected. And the reason for sort of saying this is, you know, there are obviously some differences with where we are today, but I think it shows just how important this moment is. Just think if back in the late 2000s, we'd actually delivered a successful COP and been able to maintain a sort of business and political momentum into the 2010s, we'd be in a much better position today. So I really do think this is a really important moment for our industry, but also for broader business and the community. And I think vital we don't let it slip through our fingers in the way that perhaps happened back in sort of 2008-9. So that's the first point. The second point, I think, picks up very much on what Zoe was saying about systems thinking and what Mark was saying about net zero sort of definitions. You know, we all know that infrastructure is a system of systems, and we all know because of that, systems thinking is absolutely crucial in terms of what we bring to the table and what we do. And I think there's a challenge in that the flip side of the widespread enthusiasm to be on the right side of this debate and to push the agenda forward is that I think, as you were saying, Mark, you know, every company and every project wants to be fully net zero. They want to get that sort of badge, that tick in the box to say, we're doing our bit, we're a net zero company, this is a net zero project. But because we're talking about a system of systems, you know, to my mind, it's not just about reducing embodied carbon in projects, very important though that is. It's about the assets that we are creating or repurposing. Will they fit into a functioning net zero economy in 2050? You know, you can build something in a lower carbon way, but if it won't actually play a part in a functioning 2050 net zero world, then risks becoming a stranded asset, but also it's part of the, maybe not necessarily part of the problem, but certainly not part of the solution. And I think the role of the sort of consultancies on the panel today are, as colleagues have been saying, are really important in terms of helping clients think that through, sort of maintaining what I call the net zero integrity of a project. So the early ambitions and desire, this is going to be net zero, helping the client and the other stakeholders involved understand what does that mean, what's the future of this asset in a net zero world, and making sure that those ambitions actually go through challenges around procurement, site issues, funding or whatever. Then the last point is that, you know, having talked about the challenges, I think our sector is actually in a really good position to make a difference. You know, we've got that wonderful sort of can-do innovation spirit, and I'm not from the infrastructure world originally, I'm much more from an environmental background. So as an outsider, I can, you know, really see why that's so important and that spirit the industry has. Secondly, this is a global industry. We've got some major global companies, including those on the call, global connections, and this is a global challenge. So I think that global perspective is that we bring is hugely important. And then thirdly, and again, Mark, you touched on this, the collaboration. And I think one of the sort of, you know, most encouraging things we've seen in the last year or so is what has been, you know, and I suppose is in many ways quite a fragmented industry, the infrastructure construction world. I think we are seeing much more coming together, much bigger role for bodies like the Construction Leadership Council and bodies like that, trying to make sure that as an industry we speak with a more singular voice, a more single voice, and that we do collaborate and share ideas. And I think, you know, with those three things behind us, we can play a really, really big role. So on that hopefully upbeat note, Andy, I'll pass back to you.
Thanks very much, Matthew. And I think the point that you made about this being a really important moment, and very interested to hear your sort of historical perspective what was it, COP13 way back in
2009. Yeah, COP26,
2009.
yeah.
I mean, this is not a new conversation, and we shouldn't miss the opportunity that's actually there to do something positive. And I think that's why we. And again, what you said there about Obama scrabbling around at the end of that particular event to try and get something. It'll be interesting to see those manoeuvrings and machinations. Let's hope not too many in Glasgow in 4 weeks. In 4 weeks' time, hopefully, my journalistic colleagues will actually play their role as well in exposing where necessary, and hopefully explaining as well what is actually going on up there as well, and not just listening to the spin. So it'll be interesting on a number of different fronts. Our next and final speaker is Jamie Gordon. He's the Director of Infrastructure and Energy at BECG, the communications specialists in our sector. Jamie's got a lot of years of experience working in communications, with the last 15 years in particular spent working with and targeting community groups and stakeholders, which is always an important area when we're talking about sustainability issues. He's extremely knowledgeable about the construction and infrastructure sector, and is someone who does and often makes the connection between what the industry does and how that can make a difference to society. And I, for one, am really looking forward to hearing what Jamie has got to say to us today. So, Jamie, the floor is yours.
Thanks very much, Andy. That's very kind. Yeah, as Andy alluded to, what we do at BECG is very much connected with the kind of stakeholder engagement around communities and politicians when it comes to infrastructure and energy. And I think one of the things we're talking about here is COP26 and the international side of things. We mustn't forget that it's a group of politicians who are meeting at COP26 to come up with policies that will grab headlines. And one of the 5 key themes there is clean energy, perhaps the most obvious and widely understood one, when achieving net zero by 2050. We've got some really ambitious climate change targets around that. We're already a global leader in the wind sector, and this summer we've had some fantastic renewable records broken. It's great stuff. But these macro politics and policies often don't play out, unfortunately, on the ground level, on both an international, but even in the UK. One indicator of this actually is what the MPs themselves say. We recently did a poll with the CBI and Conservative Home of Conservative MPs. And when asked what the UK's top 3 priorities should be for 2021, net zero actually came bottom and received just 12% of the vote. And 60% of Conservative MPs don't believe climate change should be at the top of the government agenda. Now, why am I mentioning this? Well, whenever I read out those stats, people say, oh, it was an exception to the rule because, we had COVID going on, and Andy's mentioned how COVID was a distraction and also an opportunity. But if you just hold on to that thought for the moment, because as we know, the current biggest contributors to CO2 are the developed world, countries like ourselves, Canada, Australia, the US, and that momentum of carbon-based historic economy. They're like oil tankers. They're not going to turn on a sixpence. Admittedly, the person in charge, the captain of SS USA, let's call it, at least admits there needs to be a turn in the route, but there is some hope from that. But it's actually the developing world that a lot of people have serious concerns about. And if you look at countries who are expected to grow rapidly, like India, if India follows China's profile of economic growth and some of the profile that was associated with that when it comes to CO2, they'll be producing more than the US in the not too distant future. And I know CO2 isn't the only contributing factor, but I'm going to concentrate on it today because of that direct correlation between, historically anyway, a country's economy and their CO2 output. And that must stop globally. Now let's get back to that COVID analogy and the excuse for not being top of the agenda. If you think of climate change as like a gaping wound in the globe, and we've just walked into ER. Basically, what happened was COVID jumped the queue to see a doctor. Now, if COVID is a British MP's distraction, imagine how many distractions politicians in the developing world have. A drug war over there, a cholera outbreak there, tribal war here. Where is climate change realistically going to sit on their agenda? By way of example, Andy's a journalist, he'll understand this, it would be slightly comical to see a reporter ask the Taliban about their climate change policy. It's not there. Obviously, they've got other things going on at the moment in that country. And distractions come into play the whole time. These countries aren't yet to fill their CO2 tankers and have to change around, but we shouldn't fool ourselves that they won't suffer from distractions. And economic growth has a risk of utilizing the low carbon solutions, despite some very positive policy changes, as Mark mentioned. And then, but how are these policy changes actually going to be policed, for that matter? And that's a real challenge. In the meantime, India and China's energy output from coal-fired power stations has doubled since 2010. And that goes back to what I think it was Matthew was saying. You know, we missed 10 years where we could have really made a big change and maybe halted that CO2 output from the developing world rise so quickly. And energy production is wrapped up in all major CO2 contributors, from concrete manufacturing to transport. A recent study, for instance, in the decarbonisation of the Indian railway network actually discovered that in the short term, electrification would increase CO2 production, since basically all the energy would be coming from those new coal-fired power stations. And that's for a country whose rail network is actually twice as electrified as our own. But there's massive hope. The developing world is ripe for renewables. There's more land, there's more sun, and currently they have a reduced baseload requirement. In the developing world, many people have mobile phones. They kind of never had landlines. It was an obsolete technology they skipped because it didn't suit their needs in the first place. And centralized energy systems are the same. They don't really work that well in the developing world because there isn't the infrastructure, the transmission distribution networks to support swathes of the population anyway. And so here, a more holistic solution developed to target communities is far better. So if we go back to India, many of the rural communities are based along the railway network, and plans are afoot to set up solar arrays along the tracks paid for by the network to provide power to passing trains, part of that decarbonisation process. But they'll also offer communities cheap renewable energy for things like water pumps, mobile phone charging, and then through low-level storage, LED community lighting at night. And such improvements may seem minor, but they're life-changing, even life-saving to many. The presence of renewable, almost free energy could become the same level of enabler that a major new communications or transport project would be seen to us in the West. And such decentralization also, importantly, makes it more local, often a non-political decision. It's higher on the agenda. It sits directly with community benefits such as clean water and doesn't have to compete with that wider gamut of issues I mentioned earlier on. But we still need to centralize or decarbonize rather those big dirty coal-fired power stations and replace them with a baseload solution like nuclear. Isn't going to happen overnight, but it probably do be too highly political in some regions. Look at what's happened with Iran, for instance, under the Trump administration. So if we go back to that ER analogy, basically, Mr. COVID is now seeing a doctor. We're in triage, and apparently it's an hour to see a doctor. The situation's pretty bad. So the nurse uses one of those staple guns. It's, you know, the thing, it's pretty ugly. It's only temporary, but at least we're not going to bleed out on the hospital floor. And that's where we are now, waiting for global replacement for those new fossil fuel solutions that are in play for the last 10 years is like waiting for a doctor. We're going to bleed out on the floor. The ugly staple gun for us has to be to carbon to decarbon through capturing that carbon and stop the flow. And 10 years ago, Amber Rudd actually pulled the plug on funding carbon capture and storage. It's good to see the government has readdressed that, but more money is needed. Rapidly development of that technology and rolling out globally at speed. So internationally, we have a 3-point plan potentially. The developed world must continue some of these great policies, but must implement them. And the carbon footprint already in place elsewhere must be captured through CCUS, and further energy requirements in the developing world, potentially elsewhere, negated through the use more of community-led renewable projects. And so what can we do as a sector to help this? Well, in the UK, we've already talked about supply chain being accountable through net zero targets and as such, covering operation construction, and that will drive innovation. I mean, National Highways statement recently that their construction operations will be net zero by 2040 will certainly help incentivize plant manufacturers to look at things like non-diesel solutions. And that innovation needs to be implementable on a global level. But we need to also be creative. Planning legislation should be more innovative too, potentially using mechanics like Section 106 agreements to force developers to utilize their net zero supply chain elsewhere. So let's say if a solar developer can get cheap panels through volume, why not buy a few extra ones so they could be used on a local community owned scheme? And if the panels are coming from, let's say, India, maybe buy a few extra for the communities there too. Basically, we need to get creative, get canny, pull together, because as individuals and as a sector, we're in a fantastic place to help. Thank you very much, Andy.
Thanks very much, Jamie. And I think that last point that you made there about the sector being in a brilliant place to do something about these issues, I think on the one hand, it's obviously the case and it's true. I think on the other hand, we need to broadcast that more as well. And we should take confidence, I think, as an industry and as a sector, that we do have some of the answers, not all, but some of the answers, to some of these key issues. And I personally don't think that we necessarily get that across as much as we ought to. And I think that actually sometimes hampers our ability to fight for airtime on some of these issues, not just this issue, but all sorts of issues. But don't get me started on that and the profile of the industry and everything else, because we'll be here all night. But anyway, we've got a webinar for that in about a month and a half's time about how do we influence politicians and so on. But anyway, that's one for the future. It is that time now where we're going to have a discussion and we're going to address some of the questions that are coming up. I've got some as well, but actually there's quite a lot in the chat, so I'm going to get to them straight away. And I did hint earlier that there was a particular question which from James Hewitt, who mentioned, referenced what Zoe said around carbon offsetting through nature-based solutions. And James has posited the view in the chat that the record of carbon offsetting is deplorable, in his words. That were the words that he used. He's saying that by definition, offsets merely negate increased emissions, and as such, aren't they really a cop-out serving to sustain business as usual? So, Zoe, what's your view on what James is saying there?
He's not alone in that opinion, and with that is an opinion that we've heard quite a lot of, and it's valid in some cases. I think the position Jacobs has taken on around offsets is it's currently a very pragmatic. Offsets are currently, if done properly, caveat, are a very pragmatic way of removing carbon emissions today out of the atmosphere. And I think our thinking is we can't wait for that to happen in the future. Now, that only is a solution if it's very much hand in hand with a prioritization around carbon reduction, because that is the only way that we're really long-term going to get out of this situation that we're in. So yes, we're a carbon neutral company and we do purchase offsets, but we do it in compliance with PAS 2060. which gives you guardrails around good quality offsets. And that's a really important part of it. So those are available. So gold standard, CDM, audited and verified carbon offset projects are available. And we're very sort of clear that that's the only thing that we are willing to invest in at this point. But it's also not what we're prioritising, because what we are prioritising is carbon reductions at source across scope 1 and 2 and 3. And we have science-based targets in place to get to net zero using those as well. And really for us, that is where we're prioritising. So I think around the offset market, I think there's pros and cons for sure. I think good quality offsets play a part today and are an important part of that journey. Interested to hear others on the call's opinion on that as well. But only if there's good transparency in that market around, the fact that they are doing what they say they will do. There's no double counting, and they are genuinely removing carbon emissions out of our atmosphere today.
Thanks very much, Zoe. I don't want to have a full discussion on carbon offsetting because again, we'll be here all day, but I am interested in what Matthew Farrow's view is on it, as someone who, by his own admission, has been around this particular buoy as an issue for many, many years, even though he doesn't look that old. Matthew.
Flash will get you everywhere, Andy. I agree with Zoe on this. I think, the offset market does need strong regulation, because what we're seeing is as more and more companies want to be able to say their projects or they as an organisation are net zero or carbon neutral, that's leading to a lot of people wanting to buy offsets. So you have to make sure, I think, that there is proper regulation, the offsets are doing what they say. I think Zoe's absolutely right. Again, it's really important that offsetting is seen as a last resort. So you start off by, do you need to build the asset at all, etc., and making the asset itself or the project as zero carbon. I think what was the other thought I had on this? I think there's also, I guess, a role for consultants, I think, in encouraging and advising their clients that when they are looking to get into offsets as part of a project, to understand that they must be using accredited offsets. I think there is a real risk of sort of quality dilution.
Thanks very much indeed, Matthew, for that. Mark, you had your hand up.
Yeah, I'll just chip in. I know you don't want to elaborate on offsets too much further, but I think to just build on some of those points, which I absolutely agree with, but it does also link into another question around the definition of net zero, because I've often heard people challenge the use of the word net in net zero and think that that's somehow a cop-out, that that we should be going for absolute zero, and I think that the people that kind of put that view forward perhaps don't really understand the magnitude of the challenge to even align with what the Committee on Climate Change, Climate Change Committee as they're now called, show as the net zero pathway for the UK, and I think net zero implies alignment to a wider pathway and a transition, and there needs to be some reductions in there, some significant reductions, but there need to be carbon removals as well. But the removals that are left with the residual emissions, you're really hammering down every part of the economy to as far as zero as you can possibly get, and the bits that are left at the end are really the absolute hardest parts, that are very challenging to offset or remove and sequester. So I think there does need to be a role for removals. There does need to be a role for offsets now, but completely echo the view that it's a bit of a wild west out there around the quality of the offsets. It's definitely not a panacea, and it definitely isn't an excuse for business as usual. That does need to be supported by huge reductions first.
Thanks, Mark. I want to address this next question to Peter, and it's from Melanie Manton. And she said, what is the position of the UK Infrastructure Bank to encourage sustainable infrastructure? Do you have any thoughts on how that might actually work going forward, and whether or not there will be much more of a joined up approach in terms of the investment around social benefits, job creation, etc. Any thoughts on that, Peter?
I hope so. I mean, it was set up recently. It went live only a few months ago, so I think time will tell how successful it will be. I think that it's still looking. I think it was an initial funding of was it 12 billion, and I think they're looking for other funding sources to try and move that forward. And I think funding, the levels of funding is important for it to be able to make a difference. And then how it's monitored and assured, and that we're getting the right value as well. But I think that the levelling up agenda has to feature there as well, and the government's plans there. So it does go hand in hand with the government's policies around levelling up, and how we can get good value out of the UK Infrastructure Bank to make sure that some of these policies are implemented, and that we're getting the taxpayers seeing good value out of it. But I guess time will tell in terms of whether we can determine whether it's a success or not.
Thanks, Peter. Just on that issue of levelling up, and I suppose it wouldn't be an infrastructure intelligence webinar if we didn't mention social value. Is there something around social value and the environment that we can basically get to a win-win situation with, particularly when we're engaging with government? And I just want to ask Jamie about his views around that. And where I'm coming from with that is, obviously, the government in particular now, with the construction playbook and other initiatives, are very keen to ensure that our industry, provides value in everything that it actually does. Surely the, striving for net zero and a lot of the issues that are going to be discussed around COP would give us the opportunity to do that, would they not?
I'm going to say yes and no, Andy, to be honest with you. I agree. I mean, social values obviously inherently has an element of net zero and carbon neutrality built into it, if only from a public health perspective. My concern, though, is that the social values is an extremely hard metrics to evaluate. And it's also a very difficult sell to communicate. There's so many levels. And to put net zero into that envelope, I think potentially muddies the water. We should be getting fairly soon, hopefully, and many of the other speakers alluded to the fact, to the stage where net zero is the default in all our infrastructure projects. And so by putting it in to a social values envelope, I think we hide that fact too much. It muddies the waters, it enables it not to be front of mind, and it should be. I don't want to belittle social values because it is really crucial, but it is such a complex thing to evaluate and communicate, when net zero should just be front, center, simple, it's zero, we've done it.
Thanks for that, Jamie. There's a question here, in fact, a number of questions here from Nigel Baker, and if only because he didn't think we'd ask them, I'm going to ask at least one of them from his missive in the chat. And I think hopefully I'm doing justice to the nub of his argument, because I think basically what Nigel's saying is we've got an economic system that really only looks at profit. And there is cynicism there for many people who don't really sort of understand the fact that global warming is real and urgent. So we can just carry on regardless. We're still trying to build our way out of the problem rather than taking a hard look at, do we need all the construction happening in the world? Why aren't we looking instead at what already exists and making that better than what it is, instead of just rushing to build all the time? Surely we should be looking at a different route. And I think that's a view that you do hear, and it'd be interesting to hear what people on the panel think about that, because obviously I think this also as well speaks to some of the criticism that we can get as a sector, where people just say, oh look, the construction infrastructure sector, all they want to do is just build. Who said that? Anyway, do you see where I'm coming from? So how do we actually sort of address that particular potential issue and show that actually, no, we can actually do things in a different way where we need to actually do that. And I'm probably going to take some views around the table on that. I'm going to start with Zoe on that. Do you have a view on that? How do we actually, get that balance right between different things?
I think it is starting to happen. I can see, the view that the opinion there. But I think as an organisation and probably as an industry as well, we are starting to challenge with what broader education and awareness around the issues. We are certainly, I mentioned earlier in my speech about, reframing challenges and not defaulting to that sort of build as normal and that business as usual. And really sort of challenging, like, is the build, is what's planned the best option for all things? And I think so I think those challenges now are starting to be reframed, and we're looking at alternative solutions, and we're not just defaulting to build because that's what we're used to doing as a society. I'm seeing a shift there for sure.
Thanks, Zoe. Mark, did you have a view on that? Do you think that we are, looking at the bigger picture, the longer term view more than we were?
I mean, I'd echo that, and I suppose just to link back to something I said around, infrastructure carbon review and past 2080, the first step in the carbon reduction hierarchy is to challenge the need for it in the first place. And I know getting that kind of message out amongst the industry is challenging, but it's certainly it's improved a lot over certainly since ICR was published in 2013. But there are bigger societal issues around the way that we manage our economy and so on that are kind of ingrained in that question. And I think we're a long way from solving all of those, but certainly beginning to think more holistically around, I suppose, what we're trying to achieve and the outcomes from this. The outcome shouldn't be build a big shiny new project. It's actually what do we want to achieve, and I think that is maybe perhaps where it links back into that social value point that we mentioned before. Is infrastructure isn't there for infrastructure's sakes. It's there for the people and to create a better society. And if you can do that without building a big new bit of concrete and steel, then all the better for it.
Thanks for that, Mark. I want to get stuck into some of the issues around COP itself, hopefully, in terms of what we want to see to be coming out of it. I mean, Zoe mentioned when she spoke about, she mentioned a clear vision about nature-based solutions. Jamie cautioned us that, what we've got here is a number of very high-profile international politicians, global leaders, who are obviously, there'll be a certain amount of grandstanding going on as far as that's concerned as well. So, I think, there's obviously going to be a lot going on as far as that is concerned. A number of people made the point in this discussion that they thought that our sector was crucial in addressing climate change, and I hinted at it earlier on. I said, is our sector vocal enough in speaking out on what needs to be done to address climate change? And I'll go a bit further than that as well and say, are we not just vocal enough? Do we challenge the politicians in the right way when we think they're getting it wrong? Or do we just think, well, that's their job and we'll just wait and see what they decide and then we'll go and do what they tell us? And I'm going to start that question off to Peter, if I may, and then I'm going to move to Matthew to get his views on that. So really, are we vocal enough in engaging with, the people that matter?
Yeah, I mean, it's a really good question, and I don't think we are vocal enough, actually. And I think it links back to your previous question around do we build or not build, and some of the other options that are available. And when you look at, I certainly think that there will be more refurbishment, more retrofitting instead of new builds. And there needs to be funding to be able to support that. And we're seeing that in bits and pieces. with the public sector decarbonisation scheme and funding available that can help accelerate decarbonisation and retrofit. But you know, in terms of, are we vocal enough to challenge those kind of market incentives that can help encourage decarbonisation and encourage us to do more and challenge the status quo? No, I don't think we're vocal enough, and I think there's a lot more that we can do. And with COP coming up, it's a great opportunity to state the case.
Thanks for that, Matthew. What's your view on that?
Yeah, a couple of thoughts, Andy. I think traditionally, you know, thinking of the consultancy part of the industry, I think the sort of character, the mindset has not been to be particularly vocal, because obviously consultancies, or expertise is advising, you know, often a broad mix of clients. And, you know, one of the reasons that AC exists is to give that voice, given individual consultancies may not naturally feel that's their role. I think we're getting better. I think sometimes, you know, it's not just about shouting loudest. These are hugely challenging, often technical issues, and it's about talking to the right people in government to say, you know, we know you want to solve an issue around, I don't know, decarbonising, getting more nature-based solutions into the water sector, for example. We can work with you to sort out the regulation and procurement methods that will make that happen. Now, that may not lead to much vocal shouting, but if it solves the problem, that's particularly important. I guess the other thing is, again, with a very broadly based sector as we are, and traditionally quite a fragmented one, it's important to speak where we can with one voice. And as I was saying earlier, I think we are actually getting better at that. And I say bodies like the Construction Leadership Council, for example, are perhaps giving a platform to that didn't exist in the same way before.
Thanks, Matthew. I'm going to sort of move on a little bit from that as well, because there's something I'd like to pose to Jamie, wearing his, I suppose, community engagement hat, but also his client advisor hat, because there's an interesting question in the chat around companies in our sector. Let's say they're asked to do something which potentially could increase emissions in the long term. I mean, obviously they're being offered work, but how would you sort of advise an organisation to actually deal with that sort of situation? So a client's asked them to do a certain, piece of work, and you know, I know people are saying net zero should be the default, but we know there's still stuff that's being built that isn't fitting that bill. But how would you advise, such an organisation? Maybe an unfair question, but I thought I'd pose it to you because I think you might have a view on it.
Well, the truth one is they're going to potentially come unstuck. I mean, you have to look at how you de-risk that. Most of the infrastructure nowadays is covered by the 2008 Planning Act, so it would be a DCO. That means the consultation process is so much more rigorous. The scrutinization, particularly by the public, would mean that would end up in the public domain. There's no way around it. So we would inform a client of those risks, and we would say, if you want to get this through, that has to be sorted. And it may be that you need a massive carbon offsetting project. If there's no way around it in the production side of things, we wouldn't advise them necessarily on their engineering supply chain, because we're not engineers, but we would certainly advise them on the political and community opinion that would be attached to such a policy, and say, it's not going to work. You will have to offset this in some way. So that's the long and short of it, basically. And that is the beauty of infrastructure nowadays, because it becomes under such closer scrutiny than it ever has before. The public will out you, and they're very good at it, and they're very canny, and they're very astute, and there's a lot of information they can find on the internet, some of it right, some of it wrong. But the level of detail you have to give at consultation stage, basically we advise our clients that you can't hide anything, and net zero is very much on the public agenda now, and unless you address it, it's going to be a real rough ride.
Thanks, Jamie, for that. It reminds me of a comment piece that we carried on the Infrastructure Intelligence website, which actually appeared in our 50th issue that we published just a few weeks ago. And in fact, it was written by one of our panelists, Matthew Farrow, who basically mused on the fact that direct action, in particular on climate change had spawned a three-way tussle between protesters, citizens, and democratically elected politicians. So this, question about it's a live issue and how do you deal with it is an interesting one. I'm just interested in Matthew's views on that, particularly referencing back one of the very early questions in the chat where someone asked about, some of the the action that's been taken, the demonstrations and so on, can sometimes skew the conversation and maybe get politicians to act in a knee-jerk way. Again, I suppose it's about striking a balance. But you've seen quite a lot of this sort of movement develop over time, and even a certain amount of mainstreaming, I suppose, as well. What's your views on on that, and about how our industry should be taking that kind of a stand on these issues, Matthew?
Yeah, so there's a few things in that, isn't there? First thing to say is this is the world we live in. We live in a world with very, with social media and internet and so on, where whether they're pressure groups pushing a particular technology, very, very niche trade body, or sort of citizen action type groups, they are rightly or wrongly part of the sort of the landscape we all sort of live and work within. I think the point I was making in the article you were talking about was that, to my mind, that the key long-term impact is whether this sort of direct action, if we're thinking of that, shifts public opinion. And I think in the article I mentioned a meeting I was at a few years ago now with at Number 10 with Number 10 advisors and some NGOs and some business people were there, where the Number 10 advisors were saying, all this NGO stuff, this direct action stuff, it's all very well, but it's not changing public willingness to accept, the end of the gas boilers or whatever it might be. And if it's not changing public opinion, our ministers aren't in a better position to do anything, and we're just in this sort of this dynamic I was talking about. So I think that is the key thing. The very sort of strong, full on, if you like, direct action we've seen in the last few days, I think is more likely actually to frustrate the public and turn the public off some of these issues. That's my personal view, and it's probably not going to help the cause the individuals think they're helping. In terms of the industry, I agree with Jamie's point about, it's part of any debate around any infrastructure project. My feeling is the sort of, the basic expectation we should have, I guess, again, thinking from a consultancy side of things, for any consultancy, working on any project or considering working on a project is, I would expect them to have a clear view as to how aligned the project is or is not to a net zero future. If it's not aligned, to have a clear view on how it could be better aligned, and to be willing and upfront to have that discussion with the client at an early stage. Now, ultimately, whether the work goes ahead in some ways is a matter for the client and the company, but I think we should be expecting consultancies to be doing those three things automatically.
Thanks, Matthew. I've got two questions left that I'm going to address to all of our panelists, and so I would appreciate if you could try and answer them succinctly. You don't know what either of these questions are because I've made them up, but anyway, hopefully they'll create some interesting insights. The first one is, what do you consider to be the key blockers to a successful, I won't use the word resolution because it'll never be resolved, but to successfully combating climate change and achieving net zero? So what do you think is the key or the main blocker? And we'll deal with that one first, and then I've got a final, what I hope is a killer question about COP. So we'll kick off with Mark first and then Peter.
Thank you for setting me up with that one first. Yeah, I think there's probably an element of what would be the key blocker. I think in the terms of COP, there is the risk of kind of perhaps some geopolitics and things like that coming into it. I suppose more at an industry level, I think everyone waiting for someone else to tell them what to do would be, if people get paralyzed by waiting for someone else to define stuff and the policy to be there. We do need leadership and people to go ahead of the curve and keep pushing the boundary as well.
I knew it always happens, doesn't it? I was muted. Peter, what's your view on what do you think the biggest barrier is to this?
I mean, I think the biggest blocker, the biggest barrier in our sector is lack of change. I think that we tend to accept incremental improvements as progress rather than radical change, and as a radical problem requires a radical solution. So we need to look at how we transform the industry and how we move to a more industrialized approach, if you like.
Thanks for that. Zoe?
So I think a funded policy gap at a national level would help unblock a lot of things.
Okay, thanks for that. Jamie?
Okay.
Oh, sorry.
I was going to expand. You look like I was going to say more. So
no.
I think we have the ambition in many respects already. There's a lot of talk, including Kermit the Frog talk. What is needed now really is how is it going to happen at a national level for the UK, but also for other countries as well. So that funded policy gap.
Thanks for that. Jamie?
Yeah, I agree with Mark. There is this geopolitical issue, distractions, other things, because climate change isn't something we see today. It's something that's constantly going on, and unless you live in French Polynesia, it's in the distance. And so there are obviously other attention-grabbing headlines, other things that take parliamentary time, come in and jump the queue. I also, and this is slightly un-PC maybe, I also do concerned that the net zero and particularly the renewables sector gets pushed into the kind of ethics bracket and sometimes gets over scrutinized. And because things are sourced in a certain way, that gets jumped on. Now, I mean, trainers and everything else sometimes have some supply chain issues, and no doubt the renewable sector will as well. But, it shouldn't take away the fact that on the whole, we're doing good, and that scrutinization should be in place, but it shouldn't necessarily be higher because the output is connected with net zero. And I think there just is sometimes a muddying of those two that can slow things down.
Thanks, Jamie. Briefly, Matthew, biggest blocker in your opinion to success in this area? Very briefly.
I think it goes back to what I said right at the start about the sort of learning the lessons from the past. It's stamina. We have to keep at this as a sector and as a sort of society, not just for 2 or 3 years, but 30 years at this level of intensity. And I think keeping that up, given the distractions Jamie mentioned, is the biggest challenge.
Okay, thanks for that. Right, final question time. And the question I've got, and I'd like our panelists to be very brief on this, so you can't say more than one, or it'll be obvious when I ask the question. What is the most important thing that you want to see coming out of the COP26 conference? What is that? And I'm going to pick on Peter first. Most important thing you want to see come out?
More nations making commitments to net zero by 2050.
Marvellous. Zoe?
NDCs that when you add them up, they put us on a 1.5 trajectory.
Mark?
Same point, NDCs, but not just 2050.
Just explain NDCs. I've got my jargon head on.
Nationally determined contributions. So it's basically that, the country's saying their emissions pathways that they're committing to, not just by 2050, real deep reductions over the next decade, actually, to be Paris aligned, 1.5 aligned. We can't kick this off for 30 years.
Jamie? Oh, you're muted.
Somebody had to do it right at the end. I'd say a practical way of policing those NDCs and an agreed punitive mechanic around them as well.
And finally, but last but not least, Matthew, what is the most important thing you want to see come out of COP26?
Yeah, I'm afraid I'm going to agree with all the others, Andy. I think stronger NDCs is the key. I think particularly from China, partly because it's obviously a huge emitter, but particularly because everyone who doesn't want to do anything in this space always says, oh, well, China's building loads of coal power stations, so it's a waste of time. And I think just symbolically, a much stronger action from China would help address that.
Thanks very much, Matthew, for that. And thanks very much indeed to all of our panelists, to Zoe, to Peter, to Mark, to Matthew, and to Jamie. And a further reminder that Hélène Chartier's contribution will be on our YouTube channel sometime this afternoon, talking about the concept of 15-minute cities. I think it's been an excellent discussion, an excellent preview to what I hope will be a productive COP26 event that will actually come up with some real meat, I suppose, in terms of how we're going to address these deep-seated issues which are facing the world at the present time. And I really think it's down to the politicians, obviously influenced by industries and sectors like our own, to basically step up to the plate, really, and to show their mettle on this issue. We will keep them to account as well, because we've actually got what I've been calling our post-match analysis webinar on COP, which is taking place on the 26th of November. But before that, we've got a very interesting net zero debate taking place on the 15th of October, something that we're doing with Atkins around whether or not we should advocate for an immediate ban on all fossil fuel investment. So that'll be quite interesting. But also as well, we talked earlier on in the event today about how do we influence government, and we've got a very interesting event on the 29th of October on influencing government and getting the industry's message across on that. So quite a lot going on in the world of infrastructure intelligence over the next few weeks. It's been a pleasure having everyone here today. I'd also like to thank, as always, our strategic partners, BECG, for their support and their insights, as ever, to today's event. Hopefully, we will discuss these issues further in the months ahead. But for now, it just remains for me, Andy Walker, to say thanks to all our panel, and thanks to everyone for tuning in and for watching on YouTube as well. And we'll see you again very, very soon. Goodbye, everybody.
Thank you.
Goodbye.
Bye.